Good morning, Gideon. We are on Mem Gimel Amud Beis 43b. We're back, Baruch Hashem, and I apologize in advance not in advance, but I apologize for missing yesterday. Baruch Hashem, we had a simcha. I was in New Jersey on Sunday night for L'chaim, and got back, thank God, at 4 something in the morning. I had every intention of being here, but my body said no.
What did your wife say?
My body,
Did your wife tell you to stay?
my wife actually encouraged me to get up.
Oh,
She's like, "You'll feel better if you give your share." I'm telling you. I was like, "You're probably right," but my body was not responding. Anyway, Baruch Hashem for good things, and Baruch Hashem, we're back.
so good to turn over, but
Okay. So where are we? We are going through the verses which describe the Kohen's second speech as the Jews are approaching battle. And in this second speech, he announces that 3 people who are starting new beginnings are to go back and not join war. And they become what we call jobniks. I don't like using that term. It's a negative term in Israeli culture. But they become people who, what's the word for it?
our jobs.
Yeah,
Laborers.
Yeah, laborers, but for the war. They're part of the war effort, but not on the battlefield. And these 3 categories are, somebody's going to close the door. 3 categories are someone who, in order, someone who bought a home, someone who built a home, someone who plants a vineyard, and someone who just was engaged but not married. So which means they're about to embark on a new part of life, but haven't yet begun. So they got the home, but they haven't inaugurated. They got the field, but they haven't, the versus terminology, chilulai, they haven't redeemed it. And the third category is betrothed to a woman, but haven't married her yet. Right? If they did marry and they did already inaugurate and they did start eating from the field, then they don't even come to the battle. They stay home because they just started their year and they get the full year off.
How long does it take to inaugurate a home? For the first one.
I suppose moving in. I don't know that it means making a party inauguration. I think it means moving in. You bought a house, you haven't moved in yet. So once you moved in, you get a full year, you don't even have to show up to the battlefield. But if you didn't move in yet, you go to the battlefield and they tell you go back.
But you're settled in your home.
I think it means move in. It just means move in. Yeah. Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
My apologies and thank you for sending a note.
Oh, it's quite all right.
I'm just starting. So now the Gemara is going to address this second category, the person who planted a field. Now, you'll remember that the Gemara points out 3 anomalies in the structure of the verse, and it's the same for each of the categories. Number 1, the addition of the word ha'ish, not mi asher, who is one that planted a field, go home, or planted a vineyard actually. Rather, mi ha'ish, who is the man that planted a vineyard, and this extra word man comes to broaden the terminology because it's an extra word, broaden the exemption.
They're all men anyway.
Sorry?
They're all men anyway.
Right, but it's not a question. Remember something. It's not about who we're talking. The main thing here is that the verse could have got away with saying less, but adds a word indicating the reader that we have to understand that the verse must be telling us to look for more. Not this one. This is just an extra word. This is limudim. This is what would be this? This is chaser v'yeter. What's the word? Missing or added. If the verse adds a word that doesn't need, or removes a word that it should need, it's coming to tell you something. Yeah. So there's an extra word. The next.
Sorry.
It's its own rule. Yeah. It's in one of the 13 that's mentioned. I don't know. No, it's not in that list of rules. Okay, so it's an extra word. That's number 1. The ha'ish, the man. Who is a man that planted a vineyard? It could have just said who is one that planted. So that extra word tells us that there's more to it. That's the first one. The second, this is the klal uprat. where you have the broad term preceding the specific. In the previous case, it was one who built a home, and build being much more broad than a home, because build can be anything. And then a home is specific, because a home is a home only. And over there, we concluded, as per the principle klalu prat, broad followed by specific term, in which case the broad term tells us to go beyond the specific term. The specific term tells us that when you go broad, make sure it's similar to the specific. And in the case of the dwelling place, build means anything, but not anything, only such something that would be possible to dwell in. And therefore, even a home built for cattle, which in theory you can live in, or a granary or a storage house, something like that, but not a balcony or not a portico in which you can't live in, right? And same thing here, it's asher nota kerem, who planted, which could be anything. And then it says a vineyard, which is specific. So again, broad followed by the specific. And the third anomaly in the verse is the word it. Right? In the previous teaching, it was, who is the man that built a home and has not inaugurated it, as opposed to not inaugurated. The extra word it, which is a vav at the end, inaugurated it. And likewise here, v'loich ilaloi, and didn't redeem it. Opposed to v'loich ilal and didn't redeem. That extra word it is coming to specify, because it's a specific term, not a broad term.
So a spy person could say that, but he was meaning his dog. He built a home for his dog.
So he can still go home. We already established that he built a home for cattle or for animal, it's fine. He can go home for that.
Just for building a doghouse?
So we have to qualify as a home, it have to be a certain size, but in theory, yeah. Yeah. So it seems, I don't know why a dog would be different than cattle. Because we already allowed for someone to build a stable for cattle. So I don't know why a dog would be different, yeah.
Cattle are useful for milk and meat.
Okay, dogs are used for other things. It's useful for herding your sheep. I don't know. It's just, anything that could be a place of dwelling. No, anything that could be a place of dwelling, which means there's a roof and walls.
For people.
Yes, but
even though it's built for animals, a dwelling for people.
That's correct. So same thing would be for a dog. What's the difference? Why not?
If it's not.
So again, as long as it fits the right size.
Yeah. Okay.
But it could be a doghouse. Why not?
If you're saying that, yeah.
Could be a doghouse. I don't see why not. Okay. So sorry.
It's the right size.
Yeah, which is probably 4 amos by 4 amos, my guess. That's for example, when it comes to the halacha of mezuzah, it also has to be a sizable home, which is 4 amos by 4 amos. It's not very big.
Right, or a sukkah or something like this.
Sukkah is even smaller. The sukkah is the minimum size for you to sit inside of it, which is 7 tvachim. I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Which is much smaller. But 4 amos by 4 amos is considered a dwelling space.
656.
Something like that.
Not gonna be bigger than the sukkah.
You're a majority of your body. You're the head of the majority of your body. Because in theory, we're not going to learn a lot of laws of sukkah now. But in theory, you can lean into the sukkah as long as your head and
Put a chair.
part of your body.
Put a chair inside.
7 tvachim is very small for a chair. But you could put a chair there. The pop-up sukkahs are nothing more than that. Okay, so let's get back to where we are. So we are middle of towards the top of Gimel Aleph 43b. The Mishnah said, Mia Ish, quoting the verse which reads, who is the man Asher Nota Kerem, who planted a vineyard? V'loi Chiluloi, the verse goes on to say, and has not inaugurated it, he shall go home. And our Mishnah said that this is true, that this includes anyone who bought, whether you got the home you got the vineyard as a gift, you inherited the vineyard, you bought the vineyard, you planted the vineyard, even if it's only 5 trees, that constitutes a vineyard. But it has to be such trees that actually produce fruit, as opposed to barren trees. That's what the Mishnah said. Now the Gemara is going to now, as I've done before, and we do often, is the Gemara cites to a brisa, which again is a Mishnaic age text that hasn't made it to the final edit of the Mishnah. Right? Remember we discussed this?
Yeah.
Rabbi Nasi collected thousands of notes from generations before him, and edited it down to these 6 orders, to the 6 of them in the Mishnah, but there's plenty of texts that did not make it to the final cut. They're collected into Seta the Brisa, and they're more elaborate. Often the Gemara will introduce these texts to give us background to our Mishnah. And that's what the Gemara is about to do presently. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, which is how I know, by the way, that the Gemara is citing to a Mishnaic age text, because the narrator is telling us our sages taught. So the narrator who lives in the Gemara's era is telling us our sages from the previous generation taught us. Okay. Otherwise, it would say something like Omar Mar or some other terminology. So the verse reads, Asher Nota, one that planted. This is what the verse could have said. The verse could have said, Mi Asher Nota, who is one that planted? And the fact that it said one who planted, Ainli Ella Nota, this would limit it to one who actually planted. Had the verse said only, who is the one that planted a vineyard? Had it only used the word, the one who planted, without the extra ha'ish, the man, then indeed we would have concluded only someone who planted. But lokach, if he purchased the new vineyard, the yaresh, or he inherited a vineyard, the nitin lib matana, or is given to him as a gift, minayin, from where would I conclude that the person who either bought, inherited, or received as a gift a vineyard also returns from the battlefield? Talmud Sotah, therefore the verse comes and tells us, Umi ha'ish asher nata kerem. The verse adds the word ha'ish, the man. Who is the man that planted a vineyard? And this extra word man teaches us to broaden the exemption, not just the one who planted, but the one who purchased, one who inherited, one who received as a gift. Same exercise we did with referring to the home. Not just one who built a home, but also one who got a home as a gift, one who inherited a home, and so on. Yeah? So, ainli ela kerem, perhaps then we should limit the exemption to one who actually purchased or bought and acquired a full vineyard. That's what the verse says, a vineyard. Minayin, from where do I derive the rabbis to include this, to expand the exemption, even to the point of someone who plants or receives as a gift 5 fruit-bearing trees, even if the 5 fruit-bearing trees are of 5 different kinds. So it's a very weak definition of a vineyard. Right, a vineyard
doesn't necessarily mean only grapes.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The word kerem, well, that's a good point, because usually it does mean vineyard like that, but here it goes beyond that, yeah. And that, I guess, is part of the question itself. How do we know to go beyond that? How do we know to go beyond that?
And grapes you can't plant with, usually can't plant with anything else.
We're going to get into that a bit. We're going to get into that in a minute. We're going to get into that in a minute. So how do we expand the definition to include even beyond a full vineyard, but even just 5 trees, even if they're just different species? Right? That's what our Mishnah said. Our Mishnah said if someone planted that, bought that, acquired that, 5 trees of different fruit-bearing trees, they're also exempt from battle. How do we know that? The verse only says one who plants a vineyard. So it says the Gemara, Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, Asher Nata, because the Torah puts the klal, the general, before the specific, therefore I know to expand the specific. Right? The verse says, one who plants a vineyard, not one who a vineyard planted. Same thing with the home. The verse says one who built a home rather than a home built, putting the general term, plant, before the specific, vineyard, thus to expand the definition of what's being said here. So it isn't simply a vineyard, it's any tree. And the minimum of a plant, and that would be at least 5 trees that are bearing fruit. And therefore, 5. Chamisha, right? Chamisha ilani Michael, 5. Yeah, here. Chamisha. So Yachal Shani Marba. So if we're going to expand the definition, let us expand it all the way. Hanaita Arba ilani Michael. Even if you only put 4 fruit-bearing trees, or Chamisha ilani Israk, or 5 non-fruit-bearing trees. If we're going to expand it all the way. Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, Kerem, a vineyard. That's limiting it, right? That's the rule of Klal Prat. When you have a general term, followed by a specific, you can expand, but you can't expand too far away from the specific. So we're expanding the definition. The specific is a vineyard, but because it's preceded by a general broad term, which is plant, we're going to expand it, but not so far away from vineyard. So it's got to be fruit bearing, just like a vineyard's fruit bearing, and it has to be more than just a tree, but an actual field of sorts. And then a minimum of a field is 5. We have this across board in halacha, that the minimum of a field is 5. The minimum of an orchard is 5 trees. Is the minimum of an orchard. It's 2 and 2 and then 1 protruding. If it's 2 and 2 and 1 in the middle, it doesn't count, but it's 2 and 2 parallel and then 1 protruding below or above the other 2.
Orchard.
That's the minimum size orchard.
And a vineyard, they're not the same.
They're not, but because we have the word term,
the same definition in terms of
exactly
what the minimum.
That's right. So in other words, because we have a term vineyard here, so we're expanding it beyond vineyard, but it has to have some similarity to vineyard. So in what way is this similar to vineyard? A, it's similar to vineyard in that it produces fruit. It's not barren. And B, it has a minimum size that turns it into not a simple tree, but a collective of trees. Just like a vineyard is a collection. So here is a collection of trees, i.e. orchard, and the minimum of that is 5. Okay. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov is consistent. And just like when it came to the specific and general of the home, where the verse says built a home, and we interpret that to mean not just a home, but also if you build other things, you built anything that in which you can technically live in, including a animal house or a stable, whatever. But Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov rejected that. He rejected that. He does not apply the rule. There's no additional word. That is my suggestion as to why he rejects it. The Gemara just says he rejects it. He rejects applying the rule and says, no, read the verse exactly as it is. Build a home and nothing else. You build anything else, you're not exempted from battle. Only home. So likewise here, Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer, Rabbi Lezer, son of Yaakov, says, Kerem kemashmoi, a vineyard is exactly a vineyard. And anything other than a vineyard, you're not exempt from battle. Okay, so it's the same as the previous one, now it's just applying to the new. Now here comes the change. Somewhat of a change, and it launches into a different discussion that does not exist with the home. So the third, we went through the first 2 anomalies in the verses. The first is the added word a man, to expand the definition beyond planted, but also to include purchased, acquired as a gift, inherited, and so on. We went through klalu prat, the general followed by specific, planted, general term, vineyard specific. And now we're getting to the third anomaly in the verse, which is the verse could have said, Loi chilel, and he planted his vineyard and did not redeem. The Loi chileloi, it says not redeem it.
Does that mean harvest?
Okay, so redeem, so let's talk about that right now, even though we mentioned that way back in the Mishnah, but let's talk about that now because it's going to be important to understand as we go forward. There are 2 sets of laws we need to learn, we need to know about fields and trees in Eretz Yisrael that are going to be relevant for what we're discussing. The first is when a person plants a tree or a vineyard, the first 3 years of produce, one doesn't touch, not eat, nor derive any pleasure, which means you can't even sell it or you can't even use it for firewood. It's non-touched. Arla. This is called Arla. It's the first 3 years, there's no touching. The 4th year is called Neter Revoi, is the 4th year of having this trees produce, or this vineyard produce fruit. And during that 4th year, you have to take all that fruit, produce, and eat it in Yerushalayim. Now, obviously, one person cannot eat a massive orchard, and certainly not schlep it all to Yerushalayim and not let it rot. So what would he do? He would redeem all of that for money. He's redeeming it. So the word is chilel. Chilel means to redeem, but it also means to chal. The root word here is chal, and chal means this takes effect. It's halachic terminology. For example, we use a term to say Shabbos is chal. Shabbos now comes into effect. Or when a person, at a certain point, the kedusha, the holiness, is chal on your tefillin at a certain point in the process. Chal means to take effect or to apply, something like that. So chilulai means to take effect. In other words, you're taking the holiness that belongs to these fruits that you're supposed to take it to Yerushalayim, and you're making it take effect on this cash. That's the chalil. And you take that cash, you go to Yerushalayim, and you buy whatever you want, and you eat it. The root word is chal. And then the active is ilel. You were chal. You made chal. You made something take effect. Yeah.
What if this poor guy doesn't have the money to redeem?
Sorry? Okay, the laws of that is not we're not getting into. I'm not saying can you sell it, but you could borrow money. There's ways to do it. There's ways of dealing with it.
No, but he's already gone through 3 years.
Yeah.
Of doing nothing.
Yeah. So most, if not all, of the laws related to the land of Israel, in terms of the land, are all a demonstration of our faith. Letting the field unkempt for a year, first 3 years, giving away percentages. It's all about our faith in Hashem. It's really what it's all about. So the person takes his cash, goes to Yerushalayim, buys food and eats there. As I mentioned, Rambam describes this very beautifully in the end. The laws of Chagiga describes all this. That a person would take usually a person would take all this money that they need to spend in Yerushalayim and eat in Yerushalayim, and it would pay for their Yom Tov meal while they're in Yerushalayim. Because anyways, they're going to Jerusalem for Yom Tov. So they would keep that cash for Yom Tov time.
You can wait.
Yeah. That's usually what they would do. So their entire Yom Tov eating for the whole week of Yom Tov would have been like holy eating, mitzvah eating, whether it's from the 4th year or from Ma'aser Sheni or other karbanos. If throughout the year you incurred obligation of karbanos, you would bring it during your 3 times a year pilgrimage. Temple was a super busy time during the Yom Tov. Tithing the animals. Pretty much all your stuff you would bring it. You would bring it then. You'd bring it to Yerushalayim during your 3 times a year pilgrimage, and basically almost every single meal you would have would be some form of mitzvah. The meat on the table is a korban, the produce comes from this, and the bread you bought money. That was the way. That's how you celebrated Yom Tov. All these things.
So then he has to sell them stuff like that. Otherwise they're rot.
The produce? Yeah. Okay, so once he redeems it for cash, he can sell it. Whatever. He planted a vineyard to get in the market, right? So he'll sell it. That's what he does. Okay. That's what the verse says.
Sorry, there was no bikurim.
That's a different mitzvah.
No, I understand.
That applies only to 7 kinds.
But his first year of valid vineyard
is bikurim, yeah. But that's a separate mitzvah, bikurim. Which had its own whole procession. They would march up to Jerusalem with their oxen wearing crowns.
That was time oriented.
Yeah, that's bikurim, yeah. That's right between Shavuos and Hanukkah. There's a time frame when you can bikurim. I think Hanukkah is the end of the time. That's a different, but that's, yeah, that happened less often. Yeah. It's only when you have a new, your Ma'aser Sheni happens 2 times
every regrowth of the
No. Maybe it is. It's once a year. Yeah, you're right. It's once a year. Anyway, it's not our discussion today. So this is the verse saying that you planted a field, and you didn't redeem it, which means you didn't get to enjoy it yet. Because the first 3 years, you can't touch it at all. Your first time to be able to enjoy it is to redeem it. So similar to buying a house, but having not inaugurated it, you didn't move in yet. So likewise, you have your vineyard, you bought it, you purchased it, you planted it, you inherited it, whatever, but you haven't redeemed it yet. You haven't got to enjoy it yet. So the first could have said, Loi chilel, you didn't redeem. It added the words, V'loi chileloi, and didn't redeem it. He added vav. The added word it comes to limit it and not something else. So what's being excluded? Right? It says the Gemara, prat lamavrich v'lamarkiv. This excludes one who, I don't know what the English terms are, but there are 2 ways of grafting. I think it's what's called. One is where you take the branch of one tree. It's disconnected. So you cut off a branch, but it's not dead yet. It's still alive, that branch. And you attach it to a current tree that's growing, and it grows out further. I think it's called grafting.
Yes.
Yeah. You make like a notch in your healthy tree. You take the other one, you stick it in, you tie it together, and eventually they grow together. Yeah. So if you did that, says our Gemara, that's excluded. You don't go back home for more just because you grafted a tree. You grafted trees. And likewise, Lamarkiv, I'm not sure what Markiv is, no, sorry, Markiv is grafting. Mavrich is something else. Mavrich is when you take a branch, let's say a vineyard is when you would do it most likely, and you put it back into the ground so it grows back up again, and the vineyard grows even farther. I'm not sure what that word is in English. Actually, the word mavrich comes from the same root word as baruch. So baruch, mavrich, and two others are the same root word. Berech, ani, and bricha, a pool of water. They're all the same root word. And the reason why the same root word, explains Chassidus, because they all describe something coming down. Water comes down. You're taking this branch and you're putting it down into the earth, and your knee helps you bend down. And a bracha draws down blessing. That's why all these words are the same shoresh. So when the verse says that one who redeemed it goes back to the exclusion of some other form, it's coming to exclude one who grafted a new vineyard or did this mavrich a new vineyard, planting it, taking the branch already growing, put it back into the ground. If you did that, that's not a good enough reason to be exempt from more. And you stay right where you are.
Is that Rabbi Eliezer's?
No, this is the Gemara period. The Mishnah itself. Rabbi Ben Yaakov only limits to an actual vineyard. As opposed to 5 trees.
Right.
So it pays most of them to have either date trees or grape trees.
Why?
Because they could sell it much easier than if you have a load of pineapples or a load of lettuce.
I guess like any farmer in the world. I mean,
Producer in the market.
yeah, whatever kind of international shipping wasn't the thing back then. But
no, that's right.
I bet. Well, look, it's a question of ancient farming, which people grew pineapples back in the day. I don't know if Israel particularly would grow pineapples, but pineapples. Sorry.
Pineapples are not.
Yeah.
Pineapples from green.
Yeah. Whatever. Yeah, whatever it is. Okay. Now we'll conclude 2 more lines here. We're introduced to a new set of laws. I mentioned there's 2 laws related to trees and vineyards that we have to know about. The first is this process of Arla, the first 3 years when you can't enjoy of any of the produce. And for year 3, Neter Avoi, which is the year we're talking about when you redeem the produce so you can enjoy it in Yerushalayim. And the second set of laws is the law of Kilayim, the law of crossbreeding. There's a whole set of laws. There's a whole family of mitzvahs. Moshe Torah forbids crossbreeding of animals, crossbreeding even in clothing, not to mix wool and linen. It's in that family called Kilayim, and crossbreeding fruits and vegetables and grain. The laws of this are very detailed and very numerous. Whether you're planting a vineyard, if the vineyard's next to mixing a vineyard and there's 3 categories. There's vineyard, there's produce, as in like wheat stalks, and then there is trees. And then the 3 of those have different laws as to how they mix with each other. Kalaya kedem versus kalayim, regular kalayim, all kinds of different laws. And we're not going to go down that route because it's not related to our topic. The point is that it exists.
They all come under Harkava?
They all come under the broad terminology is kilayim. Harkava means, again, to graft or to mix, right? But this all comes in the broad term kilayim. It's crossbreeding amongst species. This is part of it. On the basic level, actually, these mitzvahs are classic chukim, or classic laws that are, quote, beyond our understanding, super rational. Hashem says no crossbreeding, there's no crossbreeding. Why does it matter? Especially when you get into the details of the law, where sometimes the details are so detailed and so almost sound arbitrary. Like sometimes it has to do with appearances. If the appearance is such that it's growing separate, even if underground they're mixing, it's fine. And sometimes it can be so far apart that they're not mixing, but it looks like they're mixing, so now it's not fine. There's all kinds of laws about this. But one might say, or like the spiritual part of this mitzvah, is this idea that Hashem has certain borders in our world, and they're meant to be respected. It's part of the way Hashem made the world. There's a non-Jew. We say this in our Havdalah. Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol. God distinguishes between the holy and the profane, the Shabbos and the weekday, the Jew and the rest of the nations. There are borders and boundaries Hashem places in this world. They're not to be crossed. And this includes everything, cross species of fruits, of produce, of animals, certainly, as well as even materials, wool and linen. So now all this is to help us understand the next line, which is the Mishnah the Gemara just concluded by quoting the Brisa, right? We're quoting, and till now we've been quoting this Mishnaic age text that didn't make it to the final cut of the Mishnah. That's supposed to be an elaboration of our Mishnah. But now it turns out it's a contradiction to our Mishnah. Because here the Mishnah said that when the verse says one who has not inaugurated it, the it comes to exclude grafting and replanting using the same vineyard, which means if I grafted a vineyard, I stay in battle. I don't go back home. But says the Gemara, but we learned in our Mishnah, whether you planted, whether you took that branch and put it back into the ground, or whether you grafted, in all those cases, you do go back from battle. So it seems to be a contradiction. Our Mishnah says you're exempt from battle even if you grafted a new vineyard. And yes, specifically. Whereas our Brisa, our Mishnaic age text that we're introducing to give us more elaboration on the Mishnah, tells us that from the fact that the verse says it comes to exclude the grafting. So if I grafted a new vineyard, do I stay in battle or do I go back home? Seems to be a contradiction. So the Mishnah didn't tell us how it's derived from the verses. So the Gemara is introducing this brisa to tell us how it's derived from the verses. The same exercise it did with the house. And by the way, also another thing that's introduced by the brisa is the opinion of Rabbi ben Yaakov.
That's the literal interpretation.
Yes. So the Mishnah, the brisa adds details the Mishnah didn't have, but now it seems to contradict. So on one level, we could say, okay, no problem. It's two different opinions. Two different opinions. There are two Mishnaic age texts. Mm-hmm. And if Nasi chose this person's opinion and there's another opinion, you could say that. But you'll remember we mentioned this last week, that we have a rule. If we can avoid dispute, we do. So if we have two texts that come from two different people who took notes, that's what the Brisa versus the Mishnah is. And they seem to contradict each other. So we could say, well, this guy was listening to this person teach, and he was listening to that person teach. They had different opinions. But if we can somehow reconcile the two to assume they're sitting at the same class, we will. So Amar Rav Zeda says, Amar Rav Chizda, quoting Rav Chizda, Loi kasha, there's no contradiction here. And if we don't resort to saying that there's a dispute, Kan bar kovas iser, when we are told that someone who grafts a field, is not exempt. That's right, is not exempt. That's when his grafting is done in such a way that it's forbidden, because it's crossbreeding. So because it's forbidden, he doesn't get the exemption. Just like we had in the previous text, that the person who steals, right, when they came to the house, and the verse said, one who has inaugurated it. What was the exemption of the word it? It. Specifically a home you purchased legally or acquired legally, but if you acquired it illegally, even though you did teshuvah, and even though you own it, because you paid for it now, but because originally you earned it under illegal circumstances, therefore you're not given that exemption and you have to stay in the battlefield. So likewise here, you have this vineyard, you planted it illegally. So even though you have a whole new vineyard, but you don't get the exemption.
It's a qualifier. It's
a qualifier that when you get this exemption, because you're about to start a new stage in life, that's only if you did so legally, got the house legally, and got the vineyard legally. But if you grafted in such a way where it's forbidden, then you stay right there in the battlefield. But Khan, here in our Mishnah, where it says that grafting is an exemption, is bar kovas heter, is when the grafting was under appropriate halachic terms that are legal. Because again, as mentioned, there's so many different laws about grafting. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's illegal. So if it's illegal, then stay right where you are. If it's legal, then you can go. Now, even though I mentioned there's a lot of different laws, when it comes to grafting, it's rather simple. Because the complex laws are about distance of different breeds being planted near each other. But when you're grafting, it's pretty straightforward. If they're different species, it's forbidden, period. Right? If it's permissible, it's also pretty straightforward. They're the same breed. So what we're going to get to tomorrow is this grafting is legal because it's the same breed. What's the circumstance? Because you don't graft randomly. Why are you grafting a tree? The reason why you're grafting a tree is because you want to rejuvenate it, which means one of these two are old. Either the one you're putting in or the one that's in the ground. One of the two are old and you're grafting to do rejuvenation. Mm-hmm. So the Gemara is going to get to tomorrow. What's the circumstance? Is it a new branch being planted into an old tree, or is it an old branch being planted into a new tree, or is it a new tree being grafted into a new tree? And what would be the value of each of these different ways of grafting and how that would play out in terms of the law of the person who's exempt from battle? That, God willing, tomorrow.
It was legal.
If it's the same species. Yeah, it's still done till today. I mean, grafting is a thing people do till today. It's part of apparently farming. Not my thing, but
aren't grapefruits and hybrid? We talk about some hybrids.
Grapefruits are a hybrid, I think.
Oranges and lemon.
They are, I believe. You're allowed to eat hybrids.
You're allowed to eat it because you didn't do it.
Yeah. You're not, yeah. And if someone gives you can plant a vineyard, you can plant a grapefruit as well. You just can't take an orange seed and a lemon tree to make a grapefruit. But if you had one, you can plant grapefruits, no problem. It's only the act of grafting itself, the act of crossbreeding itself, not the product, not the product. That's correct.
If you have a tree that grows grapes that are this big, and you have another tree that grows grapes that's this big, you graft it. So all your trees.
Yeah, there's also there's a bunch of different species of grapes. And if you're a feinschmecker, then you know the difference between this grape and that grape, and you mix grapes. It's a whole art that's beyond me. Okay, have a wonderful day, Eden.